my real area of interest is how people connect to the environments around them as they age. So I do lots of stuff about transport. And one of the things we have done is look at that ageist road sign that you introduced and had a look to see if it actually makes any difference at all. And we put people in simulators. We put different signage up on the road as they drive around, and people slow down when they see a triangular sign with a bend in it. They slow down when flood warning is put there. But they don't slow down. They don't make any difference at all when there's an older people sign there. So not only is it ageist, it's also totally ineffective, totally useless. And maybe that's something we can all campaign for to get rid of altogether. Like you said, we're all aging. Older people are all around us. It seems a ridiculous sign. I don't know where it's come from and why it's there, and it's totally ineffective. So let's get rid of it. Right. So I've got a presentation today for you all. It's lovely to see you all here, and a real honor to be able to present in front of you today. This is a project really that a couple of people I worked with at Aberystwyth University devised and did all the work for. And now I'm a professor. I can just sit back and offer a few little lofty suggestions here and there. So Katrin and Lottie were brilliant at doing this. It's not quite a co-produced or co-development project, but it's very much a project that comes from older people themselves. And really, the overarching premise of this was just how and why do some rural areas work really well for older people, while other areas are more challenging or difficult to live in. And I think there's a lot of narrative around that being a very individual perspective. It's up to the individual to get themselves involved and immersed in their environment. And that might be true to some extent, but there's also other conditions we were interested in looking in. And that's what we looked at in this project. So it's definitely, you know, this is I don't need to tell people here this, but there's the context of rural Wales. Wales has beautiful areas, really quite rural through the middle. And you can see today what a beautiful, lovely day it is when you're in more rural based areas. Little towns with hinterlands of rurality around the edge. Absolutely beautiful. Lots of people retire to these areas. Lots of people have lived there all their life and live there. But that's not without the challenges of living in rural areas as we age. We're very interested in looking at this from I mean, this is a little bit of academic stuff to make sure you know I'm a professor at the end of the day. We looked at this at the lens of what we call Bourdieu's capitals, which is just a really interesting way of looking at it because Bourdieu taught lots about social capital being very important to the way we live. And that came out in Helena's talk again. We don't live in isolation. We don't live on our own. It's very important the people around us. So really looking in rural areas again, why some areas join together really well, while other areas are more fragmented, and the role of people around you in supporting that. It might not be you've got your complete, you know, best friends living there. It might not be your family lives there, but it might be neighbors. It might be just people who live nearby, community members, and how they go about supporting people. And within all of that, is there other capital older people can draw on in those areas? So we did some really nice interactive workshops, or Katrin and Lottie did mostly. I hung around in the background and ate the food and looked important. And we did and they were basically almost all day workshops with older people in these areas in loads of different settings to try and co-develop solutions, look what worked well, what didn't. And we had one all-day workshop as well in the centre of Aberystwyth, trying to look at what works a bit more differently in a town compared to rural areas as well. And then we analysed that, look, really important interpretive phenomenological approach to the analysis. We didn't just write down what people told us, but we tried to put that into a nice diagram. So that's what we end up with here. So the two main components that come out is what we might call infrastructure capital. So they're the buildings and the surroundings, the services, the shops, the healthcare, the provision that you have around you in an area. And there's good and bad in all of those particular areas. And I'll go into these in a little bit more detail. Then you've got social capital, which is that element that Bourdieu talks about. So the people around you and how people connect to one another around you. And again, there's sort of sub-themes underneath that. But the really important bit that I'll come on to in the second bit is how those two combine. And in some areas that combines really well. And in other areas, it's a little bit more difficult to do that. This is something that I mentioned quite a lot when I've talked with older people. And, you know, it shouldn't come as a surprise, but I think it does in research sometimes, that people's difficulty in accessing things. It's not all just about having to go to healthcare appointments or going to the bank or to the shops. Older people also want to get out and about and have fun. Why wouldn't they? Again, that really, you know, that's a surprise, I think, to some people. So you get issues with people accessing healthcare in rural areas. That comes out from the top. But then look right down the bottom, transport, getting people to go and visit films, getting people to go together to meet, that kind of thing. And there's an important quote at the bottom here because, and we're talking a bit about this last night in our pre-conference discussion, that sometimes things can be too formalized for older people. If you put on an event for an older person, it can feel a bit forced when you come together for these kind of things. Really, at the end of the day, people want to be able to talk together and have a cup of tea and a biscuit. That's all it was for some people, just a space to get together and discuss these kind of things. So you've got to allow these things to happen. We've ended up in rural areas in a really car-dominant society. So it becomes very difficult to access things if you don't own a car. And older people are more likely than any other age group not to own a car. Might be through choice or it might be through necessity. And we have a huge problem with accessing public transport in rural areas and accessibility to things like shops, services, and other opportunities, jobs as well, as a result of all of this. And we know that it's much more difficult by public transport or walking to get to any of those things that you need to do in a rural area. So much more difficult to get to food shops, hospitals, schools, those kind of things by walking, public transport, even by car. It's much more difficult to do so. Interesting stat here, when older people talk to me about accessibility to services, just how many things like, this is looking at banks and how many they've closed over a period of 2008 to 2018, let alone what's happened in the last 5 years or so. And you can see most of the closures have happened on that diagram over on the right-hand side, in rural areas. So people having to travel a lot further to just do ordinary everyday banking needs, or you have to do them online, which is why lots of them have closed. And again, you know, why should we be doing that? And as Helena already said, lots of digital exclusion issues as a result. But everything seems a lot more difficult in rural areas. Yeah, so people have ended up finding it really difficult to walk. We talk about the agglomeration of services, of shops, of buildings, lots of closure of local services and shops, movement of those to the edge of city or town centres. Really difficult to walk from one area of a rural place to another. So where the placement of those buildings is can be difficult or troublesome. There's a nice book about that if anyone wants to have a copy. I'm sure I can give you a signed copy. Just let me know. It's a thrilling read. So that's the diagram so far, but there's these really important elements, like I said, of bringing those parts together. So how you bring infrastructure and social capital together is really important. So the social element can play out really well. We've talked lots about the importance of the social element in aging today and over the years in lots of other projects as well. So there's lots of people who want to get out and about and want to see other people. And that happens really well in some areas, and it happens more difficult in other areas. So people talking about, you know, you just want to stop and have a chat about the day, about the weather, then people are seen as friendly. If you want to get out and you want company, there's always somebody over at the place where you can go and see these things, but you need a place for that to happen. Versus people don't want to mix these days. People end up living on their own, very difficult. So how do we move those people who are finding it difficult in social situations to making it more pleasant? Some of that we talked about was by communicating better. So there's got to be information provision about things that are going on in the rural area. You know, you can find out from magazines, from other people, if people are talking to you, in the local news, that kind of thing. But it's very difficult to find information. Lots of that information's moved online as well, makes it more difficult. The places where it worked really well was places that we called happenstance in the end. So some of these have become real community nodes, if you like. So places that just happen to have become centres of community. And these work really well in lots of the local areas, particularly in Ceredigion, particularly in Powys, where we did this research. There was cafes, there was restaurants, there was even a fish and chip shop in one local village. And that was the node of where people went. People would just drop in for a chat. People would sit there for a while. And that made a real difference to a community at the end of the day. News agents and small shops, again, real central bits to the community. Sometimes those places have been designed, but you've got to be really careful in making a formalized place like a community center or a library. The government's warm hubs helped that going over the last year or so, some money going to those. And some really good examples like the CADR shop in north of Aberystwyth, where you deliberately built community center of a shop and activities taking place. But sometimes those places can feel very formalized and feel very forced. And so you've got to get the build-in of the local community in order to make them happen. Much better in the places for those that happen by chance, interestingly. So just to finish off, there's also the element, and this is where resilience comes in a little bit, the individual capital at the bottom of that diagram. But I think that's overplayed a little bit. It's very difficult to have a huge amount of individual resilience and individual capital when your infrastructure and the social elements are not encouraged around you. There's also the cultural capital at the top of that diagram that fits in it all. That these places don't happen in isolation. I won't go into huge detail on all of this, but they happen within a history of a place, and that places have cultural knowledge and background of their own. And there's in-group and out-groups of people moving into an area, staying there a long time versus people who've lived there for generations, for example. And that makes a difference to these kind of places. Also, the fact that rural areas feel a bit disconnected from those who make decisions about them, particularly if you're in rural Ceredigion, Powys, those kind of areas versus the decision makers in Cardiff, for example, came up in lots of the stuff we did. But that individual capital, like I said, people felt, and this comes back a bit to what you were saying, Helena, that people feel sometimes a sense of burden, a sense of embarrassment, that they can't do the things that they want to do. And we've got to change that. That shouldn't be happening. People shouldn't feel in those kind of ways at the end of the day. I mean, some of those that perhaps are unfounded, but that's how people felt. And that meant people lacked the confidence, lacked the want to go out and about. It meant they had to overcome their own concerns and worries about it and what other people thought. Versus some people who are a bit more confident in doing that. And that came out quite a bit from the research. So that's how we finish really on the final slide, that really community works really well in the places that we examined when you've got lots of social capital, where you've got people who are sharing skills and knowledge from different age groups that come together. But that's got to be fostered or underpinned by infrastructure capital. It's got to be somewhere where people can go in order to share these kind of things. So there's got to be these shops and leisure activities to take place. But culture and individual capital underpin all of that. And those things need a wider change to do at the end of the day. Communication is key. And therefore, we need to think about how we improve all of these elements. Much more difficult to improve culture and individual capital, but we can start by making things more friendly, more supportive by having informal infrastructure where we can encourage people to come out and about. And that's, I think, where I end. Thank you very much, everyone.